There's a saying I recently heard that stuck with me, and that is the best way to get away with a homicide is to have it ruled a suicide. Now, I'm not suggesting that's exactly what happened in the Ellen Greenberg case, but it did get us thinking here at Have a Seat about the Ellen Greenberg case, and that's the case of the woman who died in her own apartment back in January of 2011, 20 plus stab wounds, and the case was ruled a suicide. There was further investigation, and just last month, from this recording in October of 2025, the suicide ruling was upheld. Now, this raises a lot of questions. How can somebody commit suicide, or why would somebody commit suicide by stabbing themselves more than 20 times? She was found by her fiance at the time, with whom she lived in their apartment in Philadelphia. And so we have so many questions about this, and I thought that one of the best people to whom we can ask these questions is a fellow by the name of Guy D'Andrea, who's a lawyer, but he was also a prosecutor early on in the Ellen Greenberg case. And so we're very fortunate to have Guy take a seat with me today. Hey, Guy.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us. Take me to the beginning of your involvement in this case. How did you first become aware of it, and what was your actual role?
Sure. So at the time, I was a homicide prosecutor in Philadelphia. And when I first became involved, it was actually 2015, 4+ years after Ellen's death. And what happened was a individual who I know reached out and said, can you put a fresh set of eyes on this case? And quite frankly, Chris, I had never heard of the case. Sadly, obviously, Philadelphia has so much violent crime and homicides that I was sort of neck deep in my own work, and I had never heard of the case. And so I was asked to put a fresh set of eyes on it. I ran it up the chain of command, and I was giving the blessing to go ahead and reinvestigate the Ellen Greenberg death, which I did from 2015 until January 2017, when I left the office to go to private practice to represent survivors of sexual violence.
When you open this case, Guy, and you look at the evidence available, what are your first impressions?
Sure. So I wanted to treat this like any other case that I would handle, meaning I was very methodical, very retentive, if you will. And so I like to deconstruct all of the evidence, make sure that I have all of the evidence. But, from the outset, 20 plus stab wounds screams, how is this a suicide? And maybe there was a definitive answer. So before I even dug in, I thought there might be maybe a simple answer. I mean, I know it sounds strange to say it that way, but so I reached out to the medical examiner's office, who at the time told me the reason that this went from a homicide to a suicide, because originally it was ruled a homicide by the medical examiner's office. And the reason they changed it, the exclusive and sole reason they provided, was that the door that led into the apartment had the old-fashioned deadbolt system, right? I don't know if you're familiar with those. We had one growing up.
Sure,
it was the deadbolt that went into the steel frame that you could only lock and unlock from the inside. And to breach that door, I mean, you would darn near need a battering ram, right? So when I heard that fact, and obviously if the door was locked and no one could gain entry other than breaching the door, I was like, oh, okay. Then as strange as these facts are, this must be a suicide. But Chris, within 30 seconds of looking at the medical examiner's photos, it wasn't a deadbolt. In fact, it was a hotel latching swing bar, which most people are familiar with if they've ever stayed at a hotel. And within seconds of Googling or YouTubing it, you could see how to unlock or latch or unlatch this swing bar from outside the apartment. I mean, there's tons of videos on it. And so right away, it raised a lot of questions, because the fact that they provided as the sole reason wasn't true. It wasn't a deadbolt.
You look at these crime scene photos, it doesn't strike you as a seasoned homicide prosecutor that this could be a suicide, right?
Not at all. And so I dug in after I got that answer, and within 30 seconds debunking that, that isn't a fact that alone would make this any more or less suicide or a homicide. But I dug in. And when you look at the scene, there are so many things that stand out. One, for example, is Ellen is seated in an upright position against the cabinetry. All of the first responders verified that they did not move the body prior to photographing Ellen. And if you believe the fiance's statement, which police did, he says he never touched or moved the body. And we know he never touched the body because there wasn't an ounce or drop of blood on him. So we could talk about that as well. Think about that. You're a fiance who comes in, finds your, soon to be wife laying on the floor, and you don't even go to her. I mean, I don't even know what to make of that. But anyway, the point of that is she's seated in an upright position with a line of blood running from her nose back to the back of her ear in a straight line with no drag or drip marks. The significance of that is that at some point, and the medical examiner's office agreed with this back when I was investigating, at some point, someone moved the body after it was laying long enough for the blood to dry and sort of coagulate in that position, meaning running from the nose back to the ear without drag or drip marks. And so that raises a whole host of other questions. If the body was moved, which we know that it was, how and where was the body originally? And what investigation was done on that, which we know is none.
It's shocking to me, given the technology that we have, given the technology that homicide detectives and prosecutors like yourself have to examine these cases, that more wasn't done to piece together an evidentiary trail that would lead to a ruling of homicide in this case. Now, I understand what you're saying about if there was a deadbolt lock and nobody could get in or out, then that's got to tell you something. But if it's one of these swing latches, as you have confirmed, and there are ways to circumvent that, then anybody could have come and gone in there who wanted to commit this heinous crime.
Correct. And, if you look at the swing bar, if you really analyze it, so what we know is that the fiance was able to open the door partially, right? So if you're familiar with the swing bar, you can open the bottom lock and, you have a couple of inches, right, with the door open. And so his statement is that he breaches the door. He shoulders it in, he kicks it in, right? Well, if you look at the photographs, both the swing bar and the bolt that the swing bar goes into, both of those mechanisms are still attached, meaning the swing bar is attached to the door and the bolt is attached to the frame, or vice versa, right? The point is this: if you kick that door in and the bolt is in its locked position, right, and so you breach it through, physically, one of two things have to happen. Either the latch in the door has to come off, meaning the bracket has to rip off, or the bracket in the door frame has to rip off. Otherwise, how does the door open? It's in a locked position, right? Meaning if the deadbolt is engaged, not the deadbolt, but the bolt of the swing bar is engaged. The only way to disengage it is to remove it from the outside, or if you breach it, as the fiance said, one of those two things have to fly off the door. Neither of that happened. Both were secured into the doors, the door and the door frame.
Sam Goldberg, the fiance, says essentially this, that he had been in the gym in the apartment building. There was a snowstorm that day. She was at home as a school teacher, and he came back and, it played out as you have suggested. He tried to get into the door, saw that the bolt was, the swing bolt was engaged and broke his way in. Did you ever get a chance to talk to him? Did he ever give an interview to you as the prosecutor investigating this case? And what were your impressions, if not, of reviewing the interviews that he did with police?
Sure. So by the time I was involved in 2015, 4 years plus after the death, Sam, the fiance, had already, what we call in Philly, maybe in other states, they called it, he had already lawyered up, right? So he had already retained counsel. So I would not have been permitted, under our Constitution, under the United States Constitution, to engage or discuss this with him, right? I could have gone through his lawyer, but I had already read his statements that he provided both on the scene and to a detective with his lawyer present afterwards. In large part, most of it didn't make sense to me, meaning we already discussed if you believe what he says that he breached the door in the manner in which he says he breached it, physically that's not possible because both of the locking mechanisms were attached, one to the door, one to the door frame. But then when you also combine that, Chris, with the 911 call, the thing that stood out to me, I mean, there's a whole host of things that stand out to me about the 911 call, but what we know is that one of two things have to be true. Either when he's placing that 911 phone call, he is not in the apartment, or he is in the apartment, but he is just describing things that aren't actually there, or is it what the scene looks like? In other words, in the 911 phone call, he tells the operator that Ellen is lying flat on her back. That's not true, right? We know that's not true. She was up and against the cabinetry in a seated position. It takes him 2.5 minutes into the 911 phone call, plus however many seconds or minutes before calling 911, so maybe 4 or 5 minutes, to recognize that there is a 10-inch blade protruding from his fiance's chest, right? Think about that. How do you not see what is immediately apparent from a photograph, right? I get it. Trauma, it's all of those things can play into it. But there is a knife sticking out of her chest where her heart is. He's
Seems
telling
like
the
that would be something that you would say during a 911 call.
right. And it took him 2.5 minutes after he tells the 911 operator that he's removing the zipper from her zipped up jacket. Which, if he was actually doing that, how could you miss the knife? And it's only after all of this that he says, oh my gosh, there's a knife sticking out of her chest. Her knife, by the way, he says, which is odd choice of words, but he says her knife is sticking out of her chest. One of the things he attributes to is she must have fallen on it.
I mean, maybe, but it doesn't seem to add up in terms of, the math of this thing. I mean, the odds of that happening are certainly remote, right?
I mean, look, I don't like anecdotal, evidence, so to speak, but I have never heard of, either in cases that I've handled, and we're talking hundreds, if not thousands, of violent offenses, both criminally and civilly, or have I heard of anyone else working with someone who tripped, fell, and a knife plunged through their chest and into their heart, right? I just have never seen that. I've never heard of that. I don't even know how physically that's possible. But that's how he attributes what happened. And so that was bizarre.
Why would he say her knife?
Yeah. So there have been sort of analytics done on people's word choices. And look, whether that would ever become evidence in a trial or not, who knows if there ever was one against anybody. No one's been accused of this at this point. But when you're reviewing the evidence, to say her knife is a very strange phraseology, right? I mean, it's almost like you're saying, if she did this to herself, it's her knife, versus there's a knife sticking out of her chest. It's just, even people in trauma, when they're saying things that they may not ordinarily say, they still pull from things they are known to them or aware to them, or that they've experienced or could have experienced, right? Common sense type things. And so to refer to it as her knife and to her having fallen on it is beyond bizarre.
If you're a homeowner in America, you need to listen to this. The FBI has been warning about a type of real estate fraud on the rise called title theft, and your equity is the target. Here's how it works. Criminals forge your signature on a single document, use a fake notary stamp, and file it with the county. And just like that, on record, they own your home. Using your ownership, they can take out loans against your equity or even sell your property. And you won't know about it until foreclosure or collection notices show up in the mail. That's why I've partnered with Home Title Lock, so you can protect your equity and find out today if you're already a victim. Use my promo code Hansen, Hansen, at HometitleLock.com, and you'll get a free title history report and a free trial of their $1 million triple lock protection. That's 24/7 monitoring of your title records, urgent alerts to any changes, and if fraud occurs, their US based restoration team will spend up to $1 million to fix it. Don't be a victim. Protect your equity today. That's HomeTitleLock.com, promo code Hansen, Hansen, or use the link below. Did you ever come up with a potential motive for homicide in this case? Did anything gel for you when you were looking at it in terms of a reason why anyone would want to kill Ellen Greenberg?
Sure. I think there definitely is a motive that I saw in the case. And, whoever killed, and let me be clear about this, the evidence from my perspective, this is not an opinion, the evidence, and there's more that we can go into, especially the piercing of the spinal column, the dura, which rendered her immediately incapacitated. That's not my opinion. That is a medical examiner who did a neuropathological examination on the spinal column has determined um, this is a homicide. So, whoever did this, one of the potential motives is if you look at the autopsy photographs, Ellen is bruised from her chest area sort of down to her legs in various locations. And we know someone was inflicting this violence upon her, not in one setting, but in multiple settings because the bruising was the various bruises were in various stages of healing, meaning some happened recently, some happened a couple days ago, some happened, upwards of a week or two before the death. And so someone was clearly inflicting acts of violence against Ellen.
What scenario do you see? What picture is painted by the evidence you saw? Somebody gets into the house and attacks her, and then what happens from there?
Sure. So there's been a lot of talk about, well, there's no defensive wounds, and there's not a sign of a struggle. Well, there's a couple retorts to that. One, which was missed largely by the medical examiner's office originally, Ellen does in fact have significant bruising on her wrist, which indicates that someone was gripping her wrist hard enough and long enough for those significant deep bruises to occur. She also has bruises to her strap muscles that were inflicted, which appears to be that day, into her neck. So it appears that someone was also strangling Ellen. And in addition to that, this could have also been some form of blitz attack, right? So there's different ways to look at this. And so, for example, if the first stab or one of the first stabs were to the back of the neck, the one that pierced the dura, it would have rendered Ellen immediately incapacitated. And that means what it sounds like. Her motor functions, her motor skills would have ceased to function. The horrific thing about that, Chris, is that she probably, scientifically or medically rather, she would have been awake though for most of it and being able to perceive what was happening, but not being able to fight back or do anything. But the point is, because that door was pierced, we know, regardless of what order the stab wounds were in, the last one was to the heart because the knife was kept there. She would not have been able to inflict that on herself.
You would think that if, in fact, the fiance committed this crime, that there'd be some forensic evidence recovered from his body, from his clothes, something that linked him to the crime. But
Yeah, they did no testing on that. So that's one of the significant. No, they tested the knife, and sort of what I found to be disingenuous as a finding was that his DNA was not present on the knife, or at least wasn't able to be found on the knife. Right now, what's sort of what I say was it's disingenuous. What anyone who analyzes DNA would know is if a knife is otherwise covered in someone else's blood, that's going to be the prominent DNA that's present, right? And so there was no indication that the fiance Sam had any cuts on him. So the only type of DNA that could be possible if he had ever held that knife would be his skin cells, right? And one that's less than 20% of the time does someone leave DNA that's recoverable behind in that type of fashion. And it also depends heavily on, whether someone's a heavy shedder or not. And that's a term in terms of the skin cells being left behind. But when you mix it with the actual blood, which is going to be the prominent DNA, it would be very unlikely to have anyone else's DNA be detectable, if you will.
Still, wouldn't you think that the responding officers would have seen something suspicious had he committed this crime? Something on him?
Well, that assumes, again, I'm not saying he did this, but
No, nor am I. But
yeah,
I'm just
yeah,
saying, if that were the case, you'd think that you'd see something that would indicate, or that they would
sure. I mean, that
preserve some clothes, or do some sort of investigative procedure to see what's on his body, what's on his clothing.
Yeah, and the clothing he was wearing, at least from the police reports, there was no evidence of blood whatsoever, which also means that he never went to the body, right? When he enters the room. But we also, everyone sort of locks in on she must have been killed in the call it 38 minutes that Sam was at the gym. That no one has ever said that, meaning from an evidentiary standpoint, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that she was killed in that time frame, right? She could have been killed before he ever went to the gym, right? Which would mean that anyone, including him, if the evidence pointed that way, could change their clothing, right? And because none of that was investigated, none of the sheets were examined. There was no blood testing anywhere else in the apartment, despite the sheets having a red colorish, almost looking like blood on them that was never tested. So how fresh that was, when that occurred, why that occurred, how that occurred was never investigated. And that's because on the scene, the lead detective, in his own, without consulting with the medical examiner's office or prosecutor's office, he determined that this was a suicide. He determined it was a suicide before even knowing how many stab wounds were there, and didn't know the day of the death that she was also stabbed in the back. He never even bothered looking at her body or asking the medical examiner's office, who was present, how many stab wounds are there. So the point in all of that is when he made that determination, crime scene unit, who does a phenomenal job here in Philadelphia, never came to the scene to process it.
Because the initial determination was suicide. What did he base that determination on?
uh, his report is based exclusively on a very very brief uh, conversation that was had with the fiance, meaning he says Ellen was alive when I went to the gym. I was gone for 30 or so minutes, checked the cameras, I came back, the door was latched, I went downstairs, I had the security guard escort me back up to the apartment, we gained entry, we breached the door together, and that's how we found Ellen. Now, one of the most troubling things, which you could have found out literally within seconds, is that the security guard, and you don't have to take his word for it because the cameras prove this, never went up to the apartment with Sam. That never happened. Right. So, right away, a detective who's investigating this should say, well, that's strange. You told me you breached this door with a security guard. There's only one. And not only does he say he didn't do that, we just watched the cameras. We know he didn't do it. So why did you say that? Right?
So Sam
Right away,
Goldberg lied about that from the get-go,
from the get
right
go.
here.
And I don't like,
Why do you lie
say why.
about that? Why do you lie about something like that?
Right. A provable lie on video. Right. We know the security guard did not unequivocally go up to that floor to breach the door with Sam.
In the history of the world, are you aware of any case of suicide where the victim stabbed themselves 20 plus times?
Never. Now, I am aware of cases, and because I did a lot of research on this, of individuals who do stab themselves to death. One, it is extraordinarily rare. And it is typically a couple, just a couple of hesitation wounds followed by a fatal wound, but very, very, very rare way of committing suicide. But when you have I have never heard of someone not only stabbing themselves 20 times, 8 of which were to the back of the neck and head, right? One of which was clear, and these are things that the medical examiner's office agreed on. One of which was a blunt force trauma. If you look at the wound to the top back portion of Ellen's head, it is a blunt force trauma with the bladed edge of the knife to her head. which means someone smacked her over the head hard enough to leave that immensely deep laceration, both wide and deep, to the back of her head. So, the medical examiner's office wants people to believe that Ellen, in a position that is darn near impossible, if you look at the positioning of the stab wounds and how they entered her back and back of neck and back of head, not only did that, almost defying, biochemistry, and the back of the head, you want us to believe that she bludgeoned herself on the back of her own head with a knife. It defies logic, and it
It was
defies
physically
concept.
impossible to do that, Guy.
That's right. And there has been independent, because of course the original investigation didn't do this, but subsequent, there has been an analysis done on the angle and trajectory of the knife wounds, and some of which would be virtually impossible for someone to inflict upon themselves. The angle, the depth, the positioning, all of those things.
Yet less than a month ago, or just about a month ago, we heard again from the medical examiner's office confirming the ruling that this is a suicide. How is that in any way believable?
It's not. And the real upsetting thing, I mean, there's so many upsetting things about this, but when I was about to leave the DA's office to go into private practice, I had a conversation with the medical examiner's office after all of this evidence was coming out. And in the same time period, the spinal column that the original medical examiner's report back in 2011 said had already been examined, which wasn't, by the way. That was a lie in the medical examiner's report, which is, I couldn't believe that they would have that in a report, knowing that did not happen. But putting that aside for a second, ultimately in 2016 or so, the examination of that spinal column was underway. So the point is, I have a call with the medical examiner's office going through all of my findings, all of the evidence, everything. And it was agreed in that conversation that at a minimum, this was an undetermined. But if the neuropathologist who did the examination came back with a finding that it pierced the dura, it would be a homicide, unequivocally. And so the medical examiner office at the time said, "Guy, go to your higher ups. What do you want to see happen? Do you want this change to undetermined now, or do you want to wait for the autopsy report from the neuropath to determine whether this is a homicide or not? Because if he comes back with that, why change it twice?" And I agreed. I said, "Okay, let them come back with
Well, that
their
makes
findings."
sense at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
Why change it two more times, right? And so, but the point is, when I left in 2017, it was my understanding, without any hesitation, that at a minimum, this was going to be changed to undetermined. And here we are, 8+ years later, and they're now, doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on the fact that this is a suicide.
Did somebody get away with murder in this case?
The evidence certainly shows that, yes.
And when you left the district attorney's office in 2017, you left thinking that the rest of the team here was going to do the right thing, that
Yeah.
this evidence would be reexamined, and that it, in the very least, would be determined to be, uh, an undetermined death as opposed to suicide, but maybe even a homicide. What happened in reality after you left, Guy?
So I leave. The medical examiner's report comes back, the neuropathologist. And so I'm thinking, oh, it's just going to be a matter of days or weeks before then they change to homicide at this point. Doesn't happen. Now, I'm not in the government anymore at this point, and so I'm not privy to the investigation anymore as it relates to the government investigating. But I was expecting something to change. And then, one day, I know that, well, not one day, the new district attorney who won the election, Larry Krasner, had represented the Greenbergs back in 2011. And when he took office, he deemed it a conflict of interest. And I don't disagree. I might disagree with him on a whole lot of things, but I don't disagree on the fact that certainly there would be, at a minimum, an appearance of impropriety if he handled the case. So he did the right thing, and he conflicted the office out and sent the file to the attorney general's office. At that point, I get a phone call out of the blue from the Attorney General's office to discuss my file because they received it. And one of the questions asked to me was, look, you made it very clear in this file through your memos and everything that the evidence suggests or shows that this is a homicide. What did you make? Meaning they were asking me this. What did you make of all of the searches that Ellen did for suicide? And my response, not to be, I'm trying to be funny. I was like, I didn't make anything of it because that didn't exist. That wasn't in the medical examiner's report or file rather. That wasn't in the police department's file, and that wasn't in the DA's file. And they're like, "Oh, we're looking at your file, and there's a whole folder with searches for suicide." I said, "Hang on a second." I said, "The file that I had a folder in it for the forensic analysis that was conducted on Ellen's devices, and that was conducted by the FBI." And that's usually what would happen. We would send devices like that to the FBI. They would provide an assist. It's a great assist because it's a great lab. Um, they came back with a report of nothing significant and no searches for suicide. So I say this, and I said, so when you say there's searches for suicide, I got a real simple question. Where did they come from? Because they certainly didn't come from the file that was turned over from the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, because that was, essentially sealed and sent to you with all of the evidence that I had collected from the various departments. So where did that come from? I got to get back to you. I got to get back to you. And phone call was ended, and I still don't have an answer to that question. I'm not suggesting anything untoward, but how weird.
So you had the computer and the devices sent to the FBI for forensic examination, and at no time did any of those examinations reveal to you that there had been searches for suicide?
Right. So I didn't send it. It had actually already been done back in 2011 or 2012. And so when I received the file, the FBI's report was in there. And in that report, it was one or two pages, that there was nothing of significance found on any of the devices, including searches for suicide.
How then does this time go by and suddenly there is allegedly a reference or to alleged evidence of searches on computer devices for suicide? How does that
was
happen?
exactly right. That was exactly my question. And I think they're fair questions in terms of transparency for the public. Who did the searches? When were they done? How were they collected? Right? These are very reasonable questions.
How could that not be in the file when you had it, but yet appear in the file when it comes up at the Attorney General's office for further examination? How does that happen?
Exactly. And I don't know. And that's what
was there a further forensic examination of media, of digital devices?
That would be very strange to do it again. But if it was, who did it? Who ordered it? Who sent it? Right? All of these questions remain unanswered.
But even if there was a search for suicide on a digital device in the home, a computer, laptop, iPad, whatever, phone, that doesn't mean she did it.
Correct. So they were shared devices largely. They were out in the open. And so, anyone can search for anything on a computer. And quite frankly, which we all know in terms of law enforcement, because the devices were given to the family of Sam, the chain of custody was broken at that point. And so, anything that shows up on those devices, if this was on the reverse, right? Let's say you arrest someone and you want to bring in digital evidence that they searched for X, Y, or Z. Well, if law enforcement allowed that evidence to go into the hands of a civilian, even for an hour, you would never be able to get that in because the chain of custody would be broken at that point. And so the fact that the family had these devices for days, what value of it is it anyway?
Have you ever seen a miscarriage of justice quite like this?
I really don't think that I have. I've racked my brain about that because people have asked me all the time, call it 14 years. No, I guess since I got involved 10 years later, why are you still willing to talk about this? I don't represent the family, right? Why are you still willing to say things? And that's exactly the point, is that this miscarriage of, carriage of justice and the mistakes that were made and the double, triple, quadrupling down on those mistakes and maintaining this as a suicide, it's not right. And I would stick my neck out for any case in which I've seen this level of injustice and no justice, quite frankly, being done. And justice doesn't mean an arrest and a conviction. Justice means truth and honesty and presenting the evidence that exists in that fashion, meaning with truth and with honesty.
Were you ever able to identify a potential motive for a homicide here?
Well, it was the bruising on the body suggested that, from the chest down to the legs, that someone had been committing multiple acts of violence against Ellen. Why they were doing that, I don't know. But that person, whoever was doing that to her, certainly would be the number one suspect if I had handled this case from day one.
So you're saying there was violence committed prior to the actual attack that led to her death, or the event that led to
Oh,
her
for
death, or
sure.
during?
So no, 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 no.
So
So
there
if
was a
you look at
pattern of there was a pattern of abuse on her body that extended prior to the actual day of death.
Correct. So there was many bruises from her chest down to her legs that were in all stages of healing, meaning they were inflicted upon her, days before, weeks before, and throughout that period because of the different stages of healing, showing that someone had been committing multiple acts of violence against her leading up to her death in January of 2011. And so that person, whoever that was, which I brought up back in 2015 and 16, should be the number one suspect. And the response I got was very flippant, and it has since changed. But the response I got, and this is not a joke, was that, well, no, we saw the bruises, but you have to understand, Ellen did, she was an avid Pilates person. She did a lot of Pilates. And, I almost couldn't believe
Please
that was
doesn't
their
cause bruising.
no. And who would do them if every day you went to go to Pilates, you're getting significant
No.
bruises all over your body? It's absurd.
Was there any evidence of past physical abuse in the relationship with her fiance, Sam Goldberg?
No, I mean, not that we've seen, not that I saw, right? I mean, so you looked at the messages that were recovered, they weren't in their entirety, but there wasn't any evidence that I could gather, which is not, if there was, and I'm not saying there was, but it's not uncommon for a domestic violence survivor to not tell anyone about that, right? It would be uncommon for someone to tell people about
Right.
that. And so, but there was no, in Ellen's, therapy records or anything along those lines, there was no discussion of in-house domestic violence. Now, there was the point that, and that, this is anecdotal, I suppose, but that Ellen, despite being engaged, did want to, in the very, near her death, move back to Harrisburg, or at least come back to Harrisburg with her mother and father.
Speaking of the mother and father, I spoke with them probably, I don't know, 2 years ago. And when you talk to these people, your heart just breaks because they don't have, first of all, they lost a child, which, you wouldn't wish on anybody, obviously, and it's a horrific thing to deal with. But they don't have closure on this. They don't have justice on this. Have you spent any time with Ellen's parents?
Never in person, but many times on the phone, and many times sort of how we are right now, screen to screen. And what I will say about them, and what I found, I, I I don't even know the right adjective to use, but normally when you speak to families of murder victims or someone who lost a child, they want vengeance, they want blood, they want, all sorts of things. I've never, ever, not one time heard that from the Greenbergs. Instead, what I've heard from them is they want real answers, real transparency, and real justice, which again means, like I said, finding the truth, right? They have not accused anyone of this. They have not gone out, saying it's the fiance or saying it's someone else or anything like that. All they've ever wanted was someone to tell them the truth and really look through the evidence in a way that is fair, impartial, and unbiased. And I found that to be so impressive.
Do you think we'll ever finally get to the truth on this? There was a recent documentary on Hulu. You participated, other people participated. It was an impressive work. Do you think that's the sort of thing that will move this along? Do you think there will ever be an actual resolution to this that brings justice?
I hope so. My understanding is that in some capacity, and I don't note that because I'm obviously not privy to their communications with their their civil attorney. I don't think the fight's over. I don't know that for sure, but I don't know what their next step or move is. But this was certainly a shock that the medical examiner's office came back with these findings despite the clear evidence in this case. So I hope there is, but I don't know anymore.
Guy D'Andrea, thank you so much for sharing all this with us. We will keep in touch. We'll keep the pressure on as well. We, before the show, talked about some other matters that you're working on that I'd like to discuss, and I'd like to have you back on here to take a seat with me very soon. Thank you.
Happy to do it. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Wow. This case has bothered me from the beginning, and it bothers any rational thinking human. I mean, 20 plus stab wounds and a suicide. I mean, I could think of nothing worse than losing a child. And I did spend some time with the Greenbergs a couple of years ago talking about all this. And my heart just breaks for them. And I hope and pray that, people like Guy and others will stay loud about this. And hopefully one day we'll get to the truth. Thank you for having a seat with me. You can also catch my other podcast, Predators I've Caught. Takedown with Chris Hansen, the Predator Investigations, drop every Thursday on my streaming crime network, True Blue, TRUBLU. Watch trueblue.com for details. We're on fast channels. We have a YouTube channel. You can catch this podcast, obviously, not just on audio, but on the Have a Seat with Chris Hansen YouTube channel as well. X, at Chris Hansen, Instagram, official Chris Hansen. Have a Seat with Chris Hansen on TikTok. Cameo should you desire this holiday season. And you can always reach me at chris@predatorpodcast.com. I'll be watching and listening.